Welcome to our global audience to the getAbstract expert webinar with the very encouraging title, The Stress Off Button. Thank you for joining today. Richard just mentioned it. There are people coming in. We are at almost 900 now. My name is Ramona Mancinetti. Some of you already know me by now. And I sure do wish sometimes I had direct access to my personal stress off button. I bet that you do too. And therefore, I've invited stress management advisor Richard Sutton. Richard, welcome to our webinar today.
Thank you so much for the privilege of being here.
It's awesome to have you. Thank you very much. You are an expert in the field of genetics and their role in resilience and human performance. And you are the author of the bestseller, The Stress Code, which is a surviving to thriving guide to stress. There is also a second book, which is called Stressproof, and that one is addressed to leaders and decision makers. Both books are useful reads, and for a first overview of the audience, you might want to start with the summaries, which are to be found in the getAbstract library. So in our webinar today, we want to discuss real-time solutions together with a long-term strategy against one of today's most prolific challenges, stress. As always, please make use of the chat function. We are looking forward to your questions and to your input there. Richard, in one of our previous talks, I think I was mentioning to you how I had a hard time combining, like in my hybrid work situation, combining my private life with my professional life. I was kind of stressed out that day. You mentioned to me that stress is not a bad thing per se. It's basically a physical and emotional response to a situation, and some people even flourish under stress. So maybe to start out positive in this webinar, in what ways can stress be helpful?
So I think the first thing is that I don't think anyone wishes stress upon themselves. It's something that we would prefer to avoid if we had the opportunity. But here's the thing, is that when we get stressed, there's this incredible upregulation of four major systems of the body: the immune system, cardiovascular system, hormonal system, and nervous system, all come together. And this all happens before we can blink or even register what's going on around us and in our immediate world. And when these systems come together, the most exquisite thing transpires, and that is that we have greater amounts of energy, we've got more focus, more mental acuity, our immune defenses are stronger, our endurance is just so much better. Fundamentally, the stress response is a survival software that augments and enhances our performance to a degree that can only be compared to superpowers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my heartbeat is up right now. I can feel it. Okay, and at what point, now you have described like the positive factors, at what point does stress become unhealthy? What are some of the warning signs?
So I think that any stress that is protracted, if you look at that whole stress response, that incredible physiological shift that takes place, it's extreme, and it's really helping us with the here and the now and to overcome any challenge or obstacle. As the body's way of saying, I've got this, but keep it short. And that's the thing, is if we can reduce the duration of our stress response, turn it off when we don't need it, all of a sudden we take a very, very damaging, a possibly very damaging scenario and then turn it only into opportunity. Now, there's a couple of biomarkers, there's a couple of things that we can look at in terms of when stress has crossed that threshold. When is it too much? And that too much could be days, it could be weeks, it could be months, it could be years. And what we're seeing right now is more in that year phase. But fundamentally, we can look at cortisol, low cortisol, elevated cortisol as one of those markers. But something that's a little bit easier to measure is sleep. So when we start seeing disruptions in sleep quality, sleep timing, just latency, everything regarding sleep, that is one of the best ways to kind of identify whether that threshold is being crossed or not. But by far the most accurate measure is heart rate variability, that interbeat variance in heart rate that fundamentally denotes the integrity of the parasympathetic system, so our ability to recover from stimulation and arousal. And if we have devices, whatever device you're using, some great devices on the market that measure heart rate variability, that is by far the best measure of stress responses and our ability to adapt to them.
Okay, good tip. Thank you. I'm sure that most of the people in our audience know one or the other buzzwords that we see on that slide here. So maybe let's start a poll among our audience now. I would like to ask you, when stressed, how do you manage yourself? You can already think about that while we are pulling up the poll in a second. There you go. Possible answers here are a glass of wine or equivalent, immersion in Netflix, reaching out for support from loved ones, exercise, or maybe it's none of the above. Maybe you're doing something else. So we are giving you a moment to vote. For me, it's definitely reaching out to loved ones. I wonder what other people are voting. I like to talk to people when I feel stressed. I like to share my worries. Okay, I guess that's
For me, it's
long
exercise.
enough. Let's exercise. Yeah, that's also a good one. Maybe let's share the results. I guess that was enough time. Just one more second. Bear with us, we'll be there in a moment. There you go. So 14%, a glass of wine or equivalent. Not so many people watch Netflix, reaching out for support from loved ones, 19%. Most of the people voted for exercise. So it's pretty equal, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think about that, Richard?
I think that's great, but as we start going through the discussion, hopefully we'll cover some more comprehensive strategies for managing stress.
Okay, so let's close the poll. And maybe let's go back to the start of our conversation. How can we leverage the positive aspects of stress?
Yeah, so leveraging of the positive aspect, the fundamental differentiator between good and bad stress at the end of the day is time. Any stress that's protracted is damaging to the system. So in order to gain that benefit and really thrive under difficult conditions, the key here is to keep stress on a leash. Turn it off when you don't need to. And the most fascinating thing about the stress axis and stress response is it's governed by something called a negative feedback loop. So when we feel stressed and overwhelmed, our palms are sweating and our respiration's increased and our heart's pounding, what happens fundamentally is this rise in cortisol, rise in adrenaline that precedes the cortisol. And once it arrives at a certain concentration and the brain detects it, there's this kind of shut it down narrative. The body's just the brain saying, it's enough, cool it. And that's the normal response. But when we've been stressed for protracted periods of time, like COVID combined with the fourth industrial revolution, or the stress is very extreme in our lives, this negative feedback loop, it becomes very corrupted. There's certain genetic variants as well that certainly contribute to this. So the body is ingenious. It's got this like incredible fail-safe, this ability to kind of circumnavigate the normal negative feedback loop, and that is through a system known as the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is not a single nerve. It's almost a network of nerves, a really complex network of nerves. And it's stimulated by changes in arterial pressure and gas, shifts in gaseous concentrations within the blood. And the minute we stimulate the vagus nerve and this system, the most exquisite thing happens is the whole stress response starts to shut down and unwind. And with some activities that are vagal stimulators, it can happen in a period of 30 seconds or just over 30 seconds. Now, those activities that will stimulate this, I guess, stress off button are those that encompass principally breathing. So the minute we slow our breathing rate down, we alter certain patterns that are taking place in the body and certain behaviors in the brain. It's like a very, very strong controlling force. At the same time, meditation is, we know the studies are there, the research is there. Meditation does pretty much everything for us in our lives. Body scanning techniques are absolutely phenomenal for stimulating the system and turning stress off. One of the interesting things in my research that I found was that swimming is one of the more powerful ways in which we can shut off the stress axis. And the reason why is something known as the dive reflex. So when we submerge ourselves in water and we hold our breath simultaneously, the brain is going absolutely berserk, saying like, we don't know when we're coming up, with the subconscious fighting with the conscious. And fundamentally what happens is the brain says, shut everyone down. Anything that's costing energy, anything that's causing an excitatory response, turn it off right now. And this calming effect comes over us really, really quickly. But then we've got yoga and we've got all the physical therapies, whether it's osteopathy or acupuncture, reflexology. They all have a very strong influence on the vagus nerve. And when we're going through very difficult periods in our life, very challenging weeks, it's a great idea to just put one of these activities in your daily routine somewhere. And it doesn't have to be long. It can be for 8 minutes, 10 minutes, 13 minutes, 15 minutes. It doesn't have to take up a big part of the day. There are other mechanisms that are able to override the stress axes that stem from the brainstem itself, like the physiological side. But fundamentally, if we stay around this vagus nerve and all these therapies and interventions, it gives us so much power and so much control in our stress and stress responses.
Yeah, interesting. Sounds good. There is somebody asking in our chat, is stress response genetic? Is that something genetic?
Such a great question, because it is. There's a particular gene, CRH1, which when we have certain certain people are born with polymorphisms, abnormalities in the gene, and we overexpress stress hormones. So when we get stressed, it's so amplified and it's so extreme that it's very overwhelming to the system, and it can create anxiety and it can create other disruptions in multiple systems like sleep disorder and so on. So CRH1 is a big factor. That's one of the genes, but the biggest one is something called FKBP5. Now, FKBP5 is fundamentally a protein that can block the effects of cortisol within cells, so it can disrupt the negative feedback loop. So when we get stressed and we've got this high concentration of FKBP5 in our system, what tends to happen and what can happen is that the brain's not registering that our stress hormone levels are high enough to shut the response down, and it creates a very prolonged stress response. You just can't shut down. And so many people experience it. They get stressed in the morning, and in the afternoon they're still like heart's pounding, they're still thinking about it and really mulling it over. So there are a couple of genes that amplify or prolong the stress response. I've got one of them, so I know what it's like, and that's why I have to be particularly vigilant at shutting myself down.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Richard, you hear a lot about burnout these days. Burnout, I learned in the past, is pretty different from stress. It's more a state of physical and emotional exhaustion. What is the relationship between stress and burnout?
So the relationship is extremely intimate. They're almost one and the same. There's 100% correlation between stress and burnout. And I just want to describe some of the symptoms of burnout for a moment. Burnout, we always think it's this physical depletion and exhaustion, but it really starts very much emotional. In the emotional domain, you become much more volatile and much more reactive. You start becoming depersonalized. You're kind of distant from what you're doing. Your confidence and self-worth starts to decline, and you've also got the physical elements that coincide with that, with just like extreme fatigue and so on. Now, the interesting thing about burnout is it actually has a biomarker. So if you wanted to, am I burnt out or not, you can test for that. And the biomarker is a protein known as brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And certain, if we look, when I say, of course, it's not common knowledge, but if you're sitting pretty low on BDNF, below what's considered to be normal, that certainly will be an indicator that you burn out. And I say that because the symptoms of burnout and depression are very, very similar. It's very hard to differentiate. But getting back to the relationship between stress and burnout, which was the question principally, and that is that some of the biggest drivers in burnout are stress and very specific stresses, and not the ones we would think. The biggest, from statistically, this was a very large study. It was involved around 5,500 or 5,700 people. One of the biggest contributing factors to burnout is injustice perception. So when we place in environments that we don't feel are fair and just, and we don't feel as right, and those are the environments that actually trigger like kind of this hyper arousal and this hypervigilance and this excessive expression of stress hormones. So justice perception is very big. Increases the risk of burnout by 230%. Then we've got long working hours, which I think everyone can really process and digest. If we're exposed to working hours that exceed around 60 a week, that increases our risk of burnout by about 220%. And then we've got lack of support. If we don't feel supported in our work, we don't feel supported in our personal life, we don't feel supported from an informational perspective, we don't know what's going on ever, it's quite stressful for us, and that increases our risk of burnout by about 70%. And lastly, one of the other big contributors to burnout is deadlines, when we're just under time pressure the whole time, which increases our risk of burnout by about 70%. But when you look at this all together, we're in environments that life is not entirely fair in most places and in most situations. So that'll probably be there. Long working hours, I think we're all exposed to that, lack of support and deadlines. So we're looking at that collective effect, and that really drives the experience of burnout.
Okay. To summarize or to repeat that, what's most outstanding is injustice, the feeling of injustice, long working hours, and employment insecurity. That's certainly something to think about for everybody who's joining us here today. So what are the top things that all of us can incorporate in our daily routines to bring down our stress levels?
So from a personal standpoint, I think the place one has to start is in the mind, and it's just the perception of stress, just understanding that stress is not the enemy. This software or this biological response is fundamentally this highly sophisticated software that we have that will help us adapt and cope and survive whatever is thrown at us. It's an incredible gift that we've been given. And if you go back in our ancestral past and you look at what we've confronted, the only reason we've really got through all the things that we're confronted with, whether it's viruses or famines or natural disasters or wars or conflict, whatever it may be, is the stress response that really kind of brings our system into this super physiological state, albeit briefly. So understanding that stress is not the enemy, and every time you feel that your heart's pounding, your palms are sweating, and your respiration is increased, just understand that your body's telling you you've got this, it's okay. The second thing I think that one must try to bring into one's life is the appreciation of how important support is. When we look at the value of support, support is instrumental in growth, in change, in us being the best version of ourselves. And when we're around people that we feel safe with, whether it's a loved one, whether it's a family member, the most incredible phenomenon or series of events takes place. Brain circuits start recalibrating. All the fear circuits that become very active in response to stress and challenge will start being shut down in favor of the executive circuits of the brain. At the same time, there's fairly big and robust biological shifts. And when I say biological shifts, when we're very connected to people, we release this powerful hormone or neuropeptide known as oxytocin. And oxytocin creates a lot of self-esteem and confidence and fearlessness, and it has many biological effects which include controlling the stress axis itself. So step one, don't fear the stress axis. Step two, when stressed, don't go into your corner, into your shell, don't introvert, don't feel that you don't want to bother anyone with your troubles and challenges. Reach out, connect. So many positive biological changes are going to take place. And then the third step in terms of self-mastery from a stress standpoint is just understanding that you can turn stress off pretty much any time you want from a biological standpoint. And it's not to say that the circumstances you're confronted with you can't control. those are certainly above you and beyond you in many respects, but you can control what's happening mentally, emotionally, and physically by accessing either the vagus nerve or sections of the brainstem through all these techniques, most of which center around controlling breath.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, here's someone asking, what can we do to manage stress when we actually don't know what the trigger is? I mean,
Well,
now you were talking really about very like people who reflect on themselves, what's causing the stress, and then you take actions to turn it off. But if you don't know what the trigger actually is, you feel stressed, you have no idea why.
So I think that's if you don't know why you're stressed, it's a pretty difficult question to answer. But I think that it talks to a broader plan, and that broader plan is that, you know, whatever you're confronted with, whether you understand it or you don't understand it, whether you can identify it, you can't identify with it. I think that when there's a central focus on health and well-being, it just gives you that much more resiliency. And especially within the context of controlling the immune system, so many of our adverse reactions to events are because of disruptions in the immune system, upregulation of certain immune molecules. And when we choose the proper foods, you know, when I say proper foods, the Mediterranean diets or anti-inflammatory diets, and we take nutritional supplements like omega-3 fatty acids and take vitamin D and magnesium, and we engage in therapies, it just gives us that much more security in terms of whatever's going on in our life. And obviously, what one wants to ultimately achieve is identify the root cause of the stress and eliminate that where possible, but maybe that requires a certain degree of strength before the investigation can take place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, that makes sense. Like, take good care of yourself in general, and then you're more resilient to things that happen to you, which might stress you out. So you said it before repeatedly, we are not alone in this, like challenges at work or like a circulating virus, the fourth revolution. We are not alone in this, and it's always good to have connections. So when I'm now thinking about my teammates, what can I as an individual do to help teammates feel less stressed? When I realize that somebody is like really having a difficult time, how can I support?
So the thing is, there's been some great research in the space, and there's a group of research studies that principally involved around 28,000 people over 40 years, trying to identify fundamentally the impact of stress on us. And the other thing is what causes us to feel stressed in the first place. Now, what the research found was there's 4 primary drivers in our experience of stress in life, no matter what the external circumstances are. The first is just not feeling supported, feeling alone. We don't cope well in that situation. So when we're not supported either instrumentally at work or emotionally or informationally, it causes stress to us. Also, another big contributing factor to stress in our lives is the sense of not being in control. And that's what makes this time so difficult, because we've almost relinquished all control. It's just the nature of the changes and challenges that exist. Another major stress that was identified in this landmark study was if we don't feel valued, if we don't feel appreciated, if we don't feel that we have growth opportunity, that causes stress to us. And then lastly, being in an environment where we believe that it's not fair and it's unjust, whether it's interpersonal, we're not treated with respect and dignity, or the procedures within the business are just kind of biased to certain individuals, or informationally there's no transparency and no clarity, it makes us feel stressed. Now, if we just take a step back for a moment, we look at the times that we're living in, we've gone into a remote working condition where many people have gone into a much more isolated living experience. So support has gone. We've lost control. We don't feel valued and appreciated and have the growth opportunities we had because so many people are immersed in their own lives and surviving the here and the now. And then in terms of fairness, I mean, environments are tough. Environments, it doesn't, I wouldn't say that COVID-19 and the fourth industrial revolution as a combination is a very fair set. So if we look at all those three, we can understand why people are really grappling and why people are really struggling at this time. And if we want to help others, and if we are able to, through our daily interactions, to promote greater fairness in our environments and give that support, as much support as possible, and make people feel appreciated and give them say in the things that affect them, it can be very, very transformative. So my answer is control these 4 stresses for those around you, and it really changes people's lives.
Yeah, that's a great message. Promote fairness, be supportive with your teammates. That's really a very nice and positive message at that point. I would like to take a minute to reflect on what's being said with another poll. My question to the audience now is, when wanting to support your teams more, what area are you most comfortable with? So possible answers are emotional support, which would be empathy, compassion, personal care, or instrumental support, guidance, assistance, mentorship, or informational support, open communication and transparency. So please vote. When wanting to support your teams more, what area are you most comfortable with? We are giving you a couple of seconds again to give your vote. Richard, what's your guess?
My guess is going to be instrumental support being the limitation.
Okay.
I'm sorry, not the limitation. I think most people would be more comfortable in, I think the limitation, most people want the instrumental support. I think most people are a little bit more comfortable on the emotional side.
Okay. Now I'm wondering if we've guided the answers. With that answer, let's see. So maybe let's share the results. Most people have voted by now. Once again, pretty equal, but emotional support is slightly ahead.
Yeah, which is great. And,
yeah.
and it was a bit expected.
Okay. Another question, which is also coming from the chat. How do you get a handle on the low-grade chronic stress people are experiencing, especially since the start of the pandemic? Low-grade and chronic stress.
So I think the key here is to be proactive. One has to choose strategy over tactics. In the past, it was okay to react to your stresses, and it was okay to kind of pull yourself back into shape, so to speak, whether it's emotional, physical, mental. But I think that with the realization of our new reality, there's uncertainty, there's volatility, there's challenges, there's changes, and they're constant, and it's constant for the foreseeable future. I think in this situation, we need to create this long-term personal plan, saying that these are the facts, this is the reality, this is what we need to do going forward, and we want to protect ourselves, and we want to protect ourselves from stress, not because stress is our central focus, and it's because stress has an impact on our fundamental potential in life. And when I say that, is that if you can't get a handle on your stress, you're not going to be resilient. And if you're not going to be resilient, you're not going to actualize your potential. So there's kind of certain steps that need to take place in order for us to be the best version of ourselves. And that's fundamentally what gives us meaning and purpose in life. Now, the strategy I'm talking about is not something that you're just reacting and, okay, well, today I'm overwhelmed, let me go and have a massage. It's bigger than that. It's basically saying that what are the parts that I need to address? And the one part is going to be fundamentally mindset, change your mindset, so get around the fact that stress is not the enemy, that biological response is a gift. Make sure that you're building relationships, not breaking relationships, control your stress responses, focus on personal health, and all of these are essential to that strategy going forward that you can then take steps in the direction of dreams and aspirations. I think the key message here is don't wait for things to fall apart before you start managing your stress. And that's where the strategy comes in.
That's a good one. Do you want to say something about the slide that we are seeing here? You asked me to pull that up for you. What does it mean to you?
What it means to me, I think that any successful endeavor in life, whatever we're trying to achieve, when we are successful in that endeavor, there's always been a plan. There's always been some sort of structure working towards a vision. And I think if we're going to get on top of this stress thing, and we're talking about now fundamentally our performance at the end of the day, we've got to start looking at it in this very constructed and objective manner. Most of the time when we're stressed and overwhelmed, everything's just so emotional, and we just don't feel that we can take steps forward, and we don't want to even get there. We just want to have the plan in place and go through life unimpeded by all the chaos that's happening around us.
Wonderful message. I love it. Thank you for sharing. I'm just looking at another question in the chat. Somebody is writing that things like job insecurity, rapid technological transformation, the circulation of the virus, those are all things to stay. In that context, what can people do to feel less stressed about them?
So this, we're building on that tactics narrative, and fundamentally in this regard, when we are going to be experiencing all of these things in the future, right now it's job insecurity and it's technological transformation and a virus, but in a year's time, there'll be other stresses that come away. And fundamentally, the message here is to develop our resilience, and resilience being the ability to adapt mentally, emotionally, physically to change, adversity, challenge, stress, whatever it is. Now, the amazing thing about resilience is we believe, or previously thought, that it's something you're born with. Either you're resilient or you're not, or you had the circumstance that created the resilience or you didn't. But what the research is showing, and it's showing so clearly, is that resilience is fundamentally a skill. It is a skill that you can build and you can grow. And it's almost, if you use the analogy of a professional athlete, they start at the age of 7 and they build and they build and they build, and by the time they're in their 20s, I mean, they've got this incredible mastery. And that's the same thing with resilience. When you start the process, you're not going to be exceptional at it, but as time goes by, you're going to have less bumps in the road, and no matter what comes your way, you're going to really make it happen for you, and give yourself the best opportunity of a great future. And the skill that I'm talking about has subcomponents. One of the subcomponents is that you have to have the perception that within the challenge and within the struggle, that's where the opportunity and that's where the meaning lies. And if you look at any resilient team or organization or business or individual, whether it's Navy SEALs or whether it's Olympic athletes, they understand the value of the struggle, of the challenge, and how embedded in that is the opportunity. But at the same time, health practices are essential, because like burnout, which has a biomarker, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, resilience also has a biomarker. So those individuals who have more control over their immune systems, where the immune systems don't go crazy. I mean, we heard about the cytokine storm from COVID, and the cytokine storm really applies here as well, because it's one of those cytokines, specifically something referred to as interleukin-6, that is a good marker of resilience. The lower the levels, the better your resilience. And how do you control the immune system? It's lifestyle behaviors. It's choosing the right foods and the right environments and the right health plan for yourself in order to keep that immune system modulated so that you can be more adaptable. But with this, you also need strong social support structures. And we know that there's these brain circuit changes and recalibrations that take place when people are around us. We know that there's this release of oxytocin, and there's this incredible shift that takes place in response to having key people in our lives. And if we can nurture that and build that, it helps with resilience. In fact, all our success in life stems from others, and we have to acknowledge that. But this needs to also be built on self-awareness and self-control. And what I mean by that is being optimistic in the face of adversity. And what I'm saying by optimism is not toxic positivity, saying that everything's just absolutely amazing and I've never been better, but everything's falling apart in my life. But rather, optimism is acknowledging that things are so tough at the moment. Things are so challenging. Everything's going wrong, and I don't understand why, but I believe in a better future for myself. I believe that I have a say over the path and destination that I'm on. And fundamentally, optimism is about hope. So that's another important skill, together with motivation, being motivated by positive things in life. So often in life, our motivations are fear and pain and rejection. And they've actually, funny enough, they're not strong motivators. They motivate us for very short periods of time. But if we're motivated by joy and hope and aspiration and these positive elements, it actually has motivation transcends into inspiration, which is a very powerful thing, because when we're inspired, we can achieve practically anything. And the key is to find that thing. What is that thing that motivates you in life? What is that? For me, it's my kids. I've got 3 kids under 4.5. I'm motivated. I'm going to exercise every day, and I'm not going to miss a day, and I'm going to eat the right foods, and I'm going to be motivated to do everything because it's the joy of spending time with them. So that's key. And then lastly, I think in this, not lastly, but another key point in terms of this resilient strategy and the skill that we can build and grow is being able to focus on the right things. So often when things are not going well for us, so we focus on what's happening with other people and businesses, and everyone's doing well, and I'm not doing well myself, and I'm catastrophizing. But when it comes to focus, the key message with focus is focus on your journey. What steps do you need to take to be better tomorrow, more successful tomorrow, be able to cope better tomorrow? It's like every single day, at the end of the day, reconcile what do I have to do next in order to make those changes and experience a very different reality.
Yeah, wow, I love your positive energy. There seems to be a lot that we can do. Great. There is another really good question in the chat, and thank you to the audience again that you are participating so lively here. So the question is it a good strategy to step consciously into stressful situations to get a routine? Can you develop a stress routine?
You can. So it's referred to as stress inoculation. So if you expose yourself to stressful events purposefully and intentionally, and you can control the duration, it actually makes you more equipped to handle stress on a regular basis. The best form of stress inoculation is not so much on the emotional side and the mental side, but rather in the physical state or capacity. So a good example of stress inoculation is being immersed in an ice bath is a physical stress. It evokes all the same responses as a psychological stress. So you're getting in, you're training your system to release the adrenalines, release the dopamine, get the cortisol levels up, and training it to recalibrate. Very intense exercise where you're having to push yourself hard is another form of stress simulation. So I think it's a great strategy if you're at that place and if you're in that state to start training yourself to withstand these extremes in biological shifts. Really good input, that.
I like it. There is one question which is kind of important to me to mention that today. What are some of the ways in which leaders, be it like really high-level leaders or team leaders, can address stress in a remote work environment? I mean, that's something which is probably also to stay remote or hybrid. And how can leaders support or address stress?
So I think that's the biggest challenge of our time right now, is that we've had this recalibration of work. And the funny thing is that I've noticed with all the businesses that I consult to, I've noticed this evolution in this change in the experience of stress from remote working. Initially, the stress experience was the long working hours, just with all the teams and the webinars and the meetings, and the days were extended by around 2 hours, and that was a big pressure, and that was creating burnout. But people seem to get on top of that. I think schedules becoming a little bit more disciplined, a little bit more structured. And what started manifesting is not so much the long working hours from this new way of engaging, but rather the big stresses that surfaced, that in my experience were a lack of instrumental and informational support. People just didn't feel they had enough assistance, enough guidance, enough mentorship to get through what they needed to get through. And there was this big theme, and there is this big theme of loneliness. And the younger generations are far more susceptible to the experience of loneliness than the older populations. We think it's the other way around, but it's not. And now, as we know, loneliness is associated, one, with reduced coping mechanism, increased stress perception, mental health compromise, and so on. So I think in order to mitigate these two pressing issues that are so prevalent right now, as a leader, one can mitigate the lack of support by creating a personal checklist that includes both emotional and instrumental aspects. So emotionally, it could be personal connection. Are you connected personally with your team? Is there enough empathy? Are you available enough to your team? And from an instrumental perspective, am I providing enough guidance and practical support? And is there enough upskilling within the environment? But the bigger question really, I think, centers around loneliness. How do we reduce the burden of loneliness when everyone is so disconnected? And I'm just going to put forward a couple of strategies. I think that first and foremost, one has to encourage as much social connection, mutual support in one's teams. But at the same time, people kind of move together, grow together when they learn together. And I think there's this huge movement in upskilling because most of our skills are not going to be relevant in the next couple of years. And I think that if we can create environments of shared learning, it really brings people together and makes them feel less lonely. More group projects where possible, I think that is hugely beneficial. Collective accountability, where people are collectively responsible for an outcome, really builds connections. But I think that one of the strongest forces is when a business has an identity and a strong set of values, whether the value set is attached to environmental issues or the value set is attached to social issues. These are key things that people connect to themselves. And when you feel part of something bigger, that experience and feeling of loneliness actually becomes mitigated and reduced. Another nice thing that leaders could do, just the last one off the top of my head, is just a weekly check-in with their immediate team. 5 minutes, don't talk about work personally. How are you doing? How are you coping? What can I do? And it really makes such a difference.
My team has a Tuesday's coffee break, 5 minutes. I missed that today due to our webinar, but that way I'm sending greetings to my teammates who might be watching. It's really awesome, and it's so nice to connect with people. It's really good. A good tip. On an organizational level, how can organizations develop a culture that respects vulnerability so that people feel they are in a safe place to say, hey, I'm not okay?
I think we experience that more and more. I mean, the prevalence of mental health issues has exploded globally for a number of different reasons. And also it's become more acceptable. It's become something that I think is part and parcel of our social set. And I think that's great that there's this openness that is starting to arise. But I think at the core of one feeling safe enough to say, I'm just not coping. We've all been there at some stage in my life. I've been there several times where it's just the set has been overwhelming. I've really struggled emotionally. Volatility is not sleeping. I think the key thing to changing this perception of always being okay and always being strong and always being admired and recognized. I think the first step in changing the environment where that is how we expect it to be behaved rather than being authentic in how we're feeling and how we're relating to the world is leaders have to come on board. And I think when leaders show their vulnerabilities and when they talk about some of the challenges they've overcome and confronted and the adversity that they've had to circumnavigate and especially how they've been able to do it, I think it really creates a culture where there's safety in expressing some of the challenges that exist within people's lives.
Yeah, and I think what is also a trend these days, what many corporations try and also do successfully, is incorporate well-being initiatives. So my question would be, how can you make sure that such an initiative doesn't become another stress factor?
So the answer in this respect lies with shared responsibility. So I think just handing over additional responsibilities into teams, I don't think effectively speaks to any wellness or performance vision, saying that here we're going to dump a whole bunch of new skills and resources onto you and you manage yourself. But when you start looking at this dynamic between businesses and the teams that exist within the business that fundamentally drive the business, a business is essentially the individuals who come to work, the skills that they've acquired over many decades and the time they're willing to invest. And when you look at the business and its teams and you look at their needs and goals and aspirations, you see that both the individual and both the business wants greater productivity, and they want the realization of individual and group and business potential. Every individual wants to be more engaged. The business wants more engagement. Every individual wants to be more motivated at work and more inspired at work. The business wants that as well. Every individual wants to be present and wants to be healthy and functional, and that's what the business wants. So there's this absolute synergy that exists. And I think that when we say that, okay, well, this is the relationship that exists and this is the reality exists, the business has this responsibility that is twofold. So first, yes, it's valuable to say, here's some great tools, here's some education, here's some resources for stress and health management and health promotion. The key is not to push it onto people. Some people just are not that way inclined, and you don't want to be forced into that lifestyle, into that context. But I think that the more pressing responsibility is to say that, okay, well, these are the stresses that our teams are experiencing right now. And we want to create that optimal working environment. And there was a brilliant study. It was a meta-analysis, Australian meta-analysis, 90 studies looking at different approaches to organizational wellness and organizational performance. And some of the approaches were very reactive. So you're looking at teams once they're stressed and then trying to manage them following that experience and the time that they had to take off and the readmission to work and those type of protocols. Another program was, or another intervention style was saying that here are the skills and here are the resources to protect you against some of the stresses you're experiencing. And the last intervention style was very much centered around, let's ring fence our teams, let's protect our teams from the stresses that they're likely to experience. And they were looking at principally organizational performance and effectiveness, also on an individual level. And what they found was that by far and away the most effective strategy in improving organizational performance from a stress standpoint and stress management standpoint was ring fencing, cut the stress off before it arrives at the individual. And at the same time, yes, there's going to be this joint responsibility where your teams will need to acknowledge that they have a role and a responsibility to manage their own health and well-being. But things like work-family conflict, loneliness, employment insecurity, deadlines, effort, reward, imbalance, long hours, limited support, if one can manage that more successfully through analytics and strategies, sure, the whole landscape changes.
Richard, this is all super, super interesting. I'm sure there would be so much more to say. Also, people have been really active in our chat today. Unfortunately, we cannot address every question that's being asked there. Yeah, time flew by. We are almost at the end of our session. I want to say thank you so much for this thought-provoking 45 minutes that we just shared. And also to our audience, thank you for participating. Thank you for being there today. You will receive the recording of this event in the next days. And for more relevant content on the topic, check out the channels in the getAbstract library. There is, for example, mental health, sleep, mindfulness, resilience, happiness, positive thinking, depression, burnout, healthy workplace. Those are only a couple of channels which come to the top of my mind immediately, but there are many, many more with super interesting content. Again, I want to recommend the summaries of Stressproof and the Stress Code. And yeah, here you can also see the author's contact information. Get in touch if you want to. If we couldn't address your question today, feel free to write to Richard directly. And yeah, I'm sending loads of positive thoughts your way, wishing you all a great day. Thank you again, Richard, for joining us from South Africa.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks everyone for giving up your valuable time.
I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you, and I'm looking forward to hearing also from you again, Richard. Have a good day, and see you next time. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.